Hello and welcome to another edition of Be Still My Soul. Today we're looking at Psalm 31. When you're at the end of yourself, what do you do? Well, the answer is pray. That's the answer that David gives here in Psalm 31. You see, David knew what it was to come to the end of himself again and again and again. He knew what it was like to be surrounded by his enemies. He knew what it was like to feel that life was very hard and for circumstances to be very bad. He knew times of deep distress. But he also trusted the Lord and he prayed. And in this psalm, he encourages us to do the same. He recalls those times of deep distress, and he thanks God for his goodness in delivering him out of them all. David says, when you are in that situation, pray. So there's three things I want us to see from this psalm. First of all, a prayer for God's help, praise for God's help, and why you and I can be confident that God will help us too. So first of all, a prayer for God's help. David begins the psalm with a wonderful expression of trust in the Lord. In you, O Lord, do I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. He pours out his heart to God. God who he knows as his Father, who has promised to take care of him and love him. And that gives him comfort. Come quickly, he says. He's desperate. He's urgent. See, that's what prayer is. It's giving God offering to God the desires of our heart. Now, David's confidence in prayer rests on two things. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake, you lead and guide me. The two things that David's confidence in prayer rests are first of all, that God will deliver for the sake of his name. God's name was given by God to Israel. He identifies himself with his people, and therefore what happens to them reflects on God. So God has to save his people. Otherwise, people will diss his name. And God is also the rock of his people. Not that he's grey, but that he's steady. He's able to save and deliver. He's a refuge, a fortress to protect. He's righteous. He cares for his people and wants to deliver them and save them. And so David cries out to this God. And he cries out because verse 4, you have taken me out of the net they have hidden for me, for you are my refuge. But people had laid a trap for him. His enemies were out to trick him. And so he cried out to God. And he submitted to God, verse 5. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. He submits to the Lord because he knows he can trust him. In fact, he goes a step further in verses 6 to 8 because he rejoices in anticipation that his prayer will be answered. He says, verse 6, I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You have known the distress of my soul, and you have not delivered me into the hand of the enemy. You have set my feet in a broad place. This isn't blind trust. He's focused on the God he knows and loves, and he knows he can trust him because he's the God of truth. And he's faithful. And he can trust him because he's the God of love. A God of love who has delivered his people in the past. And therefore, because of God's love towards him, his redeeming love towards him, he will rejoice because he anticipates deliverance. And that in anticipation of deliverance, if you know you're going to be saved and delivered, it gives you freedom. It brings you peace and sense of security. You know everything is going to be okay because God is going to rescue you. David knows that because he knows what God is like. God is not like the worthless idols who are not true and not loving. God is a God of faithfulness and love. And so he cries out to God in distress. That's what he does in verse 9. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted from grief, my soul and my body also, for my life is spent with sorrow and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity and my bones waste away. His enemies have created this distress. They're the agents of death, and he casts himself on God's mercy in deep despair. He feels his whole life is ebbing away from him, both mentally, he's in anguish, physically, he's at the point of death, and spiritually, he feels God has abandoned him and is far from him. Have you ever felt like that? Well, if you do, then cry to God in your distress. He's a God you can trust in. Verse 11, he continues, because of all my adversaries, I have become a reproach. He feels mocked and slandered, especially to my neighbours, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from him. He feels isolated and rejected. I have been forgotten like one who is dead. I have become like a broken vessel. I'm useless. My life is useless. For I hear the whispering of many. He's surrounded by people, and they're whispering about him. And what are they whispering? Terror on every side. As they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life. He's surrounded by troubles. He's sad. He feels ashamed. God has promised him life, and all he's experiencing is death. But he doesn't stay there, reflecting in detail on his troubles, but he reaffirms his trust in the Lord. He repeats what he said earlier, but with an increased sense of confidence in God, his Redeemer. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. God isn't just a vague, powerful force up there. To David, God is personal. He's his God. And so he commits himself to God. He commits his circumstances to God. My times are in your hands. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors. He commits himself to God's love. Verse 16, may your face shine on your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. He prays for a resolution to this whole issue of distress, for an end to his adversaries. Verse 17, O Lord, let me not be put to shame, for I call upon you. Let the wicked be put to shame. Let them go silently to Sheol. Let the lying lips be mute, which speak insolently against the righteous in pride and contempt. He says, may my enemies be silenced and ashamed because they're wicked. You know, when you're in distress, when people are against you, detail your distress to God. He cares for you. And pray to God about what you want to happen. Pray to God that the wicked would not prosper, but the righteous will be vindicated. And now he turns in the psalm from prayer to praise. He praises God for his help. He first of all affirms God's goodness. Oh, how abundant is your goodness, verse 19, which you have stored up for those who fear you and worked for those who take refuge in you, in the sight of the children of mankind. In the cover of your presence, you hide them from the plots of men. You store them in your shelter from the strife of tongues. Blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me. When I was in a besieged city, maybe he's reflecting on a time when he was in a city which was surrounded by enemies and he couldn't get out. I had said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. But you heard the voice of my plea for mercy when I cried to you for help. He affirms God's goodness. He says God works things out right for those who trust him. If you're trusting in the Lord, God will work things out right. He works all things together for good to those who trust him, to those who hope in his goodness. Because not only does God work things out right, but God is right for his people. Not only does God work things out in a good way for his people, but he is good to his people. He relates to you and me, his people, with truth and with love. He wants to do us good. And so finally, David encourages other people to keep trusting in the Lord. Love the Lord, O you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong and let your heart take courage, O you who wait for the Lord. What a good word. You know, it's hard to trust the Lord when times are hard and difficult, when trouble is near, when you're under stress. But the Lord loves us and will come to our rescue. He did for me, says David. He will do for you. David says, learn from my experience. Look to my experience. He will help you. Trust him regardless of your circumstances. Commit yourself to him. Hope in him. You know, the clouds might hide the sun, but it's always shining. You know, you might be going through a time where life just seems cloudy and the clouds seem thick and you can't see the way ahead. But the sun is still shining. God is still good. He is still loving you and will work things out for your good. Then why can we be confident that God will do that? How do we know that God will bring us into that freedom that David experienced? How do we know that God will work out everything for our good? How can you keep trusting him when the clouds of despair gather? How can you put yourself into God's hands confidently? How can you say, verse 5, into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. Because that's what Jesus said when he died on the cross. Some of the last words that he said were those words from verse 5, into your hand I commit my spirit. You see, because Jesus Christ on the cross committed his spirit into God's hand, you can. Because he did it for you and for me. When he was dying on the cross, committing himself into the hands of God, he was betrayed. He was rejected. He was isolated. He was forsaken. Now, for you and me, for our sins, for all the things that we've done which we know we shouldn't, and the things that we haven't done which we know we should. That's what he was doing for you and me. And if you know his love, if you know he did that for you, you can trust him in every circumstance. He's not going to let you down. He's going to bring you through. David says, he did it for me. He'll do it for you. Psalm 31. Thank you so much for listening. God bless.